Hi, my name is Yvette Hagerman, and I chose to do my historical timeline on Native American education. Imagine living with your families in the wide open plains of your country. Your daily life as a Native American child consists of learning how to farm, hunt, cook, and speak in your tribal language, and learn about your culture from other members of the tribe through stories told by tribal members. Now imagine the arrival of people from another country, different in appearance, cultural beliefs, and language. The Europeans continue to arrive in their newfound country, bringing with them their disease, religious beliefs, culture, greed, and lack of knowledge of the human beings who already lived in this country. Remember, the Europeans came to this new world to establish new colonies, explore the land, and for reasons of religious freedom. As the number of immigrants to the New World increased, so did the need for more land. The life of the Native Americans was about to change forever. The new settlers did not understand the Native American people that they found in the new country. They felt that they were uncivilized. The Native people wore clothing made from animal skins, they slept in tents made from animal hides, and they did not live in the cities or towns, and worst of all, they did not go to church. The settlers felt that this was their duty to convert these savages into good, God-fearing Christians. The settlers felt that their belief was that if they could convert the Native Americans and assimilate them into the white man's culture, relocating the tribes to take their land would not be considered inhumane. They would be doing them a favor by showing them how to build houses and towns, and how to live in a more civilized cultural fashion. The reason I chose to do a timeline on Native American education is that I am a descendant of the Shawnee tribe from Tennessee. I have always been appalled by the treatment of Native Americans in their own country by settlers who claim to be Christians. Throughout history concerning civil rights, discrimination, slavery, and inhumane treatments of our fellow man, I feel that our country still falls short when it comes to fair treatment of Native American people. Native Americans lived in this country before we ever arrived. They lived their lives in harmony with Mother Nature. They believed in a spirit bigger than themselves, and the land provided them with everything they needed to exist. For white settlers to come into this country and take everything away from the Native American people, to put their children into boarding schools, strip them of their culture, and force them to live on reservations so we could have their land is a travesty. The timeline I have created begins in 1617 with the first experimental school in Virginia designed to educate Native American children in Christianity, and ends with the Title VII Bilingual Education Act of 1974, which provides funding for development of bilingual programs in Indian schools. Many events outlined in my timeline involve laws and acts passed that have effect on the education of Native American children. What I have created also is props for my timeline so that you have pictures to go with it. So my introduction, this is a picture of all the tribes that lived in this country before we arrived. So my introduction was imagine living with your families in the wide open plains of your country. Your daily life as a Native American child consists of learning how to farm, hunt, cook, speak in your native tribal language, and learn about your culture from stories told by tribal members. Now imagine your lives being changed by the arrival of strange people who speak and dress differently and force their beliefs on your people. Then they take it all. (1617 to 1619). The first efforts to educate Native American children is the East India School for Indians, was funded by the Virginia Company. The school was located in Charles City, Virginia, run by Reverend Patrick Copeland. Took donations to open the first Native American college in Henrico. Donations, excuse me. The purpose of Henrico College was the first college designed to educate Native American through college. A large parcel was set aside for the education of white children. The smaller parcel was related to the Indian college and the Indian school set up. Unfortunately, The experimental school in Virginia was halted due to the Indian attack led by Opechancanough against the colony on March 23rd, 1622. In 1635, the first Latin American grammar school is established in Boston, Massachusetts. Based on the perennial education philosophy rooted in realism, the school was designed only for sons of a certain social class. These students were destined for leadership positions in the states, courts, and church leaders. Students were not admitted into the schools until they had mastered their own language. These grammar schools were designed to prepare students for entrance into Harvard. These schools came about because of the concerns of the Puritan families having educated leaders in the ministries. Children learned reading, writing, arithmetic, and would eventually be able to read and speak Latin and Greek. Also in 1635, the first free public school opens up in Virginia. In 1647, Massachusetts law, Massachusetts law of 1647, also known as the Old DeLauder-Satan Act, is passed. This law requires all towns to publicly fund elementary schools. Towns of at least 50 families were required to hire a schoolmaster to teach the children to write and read. Towns of 100 or more families were required to hire a Latin grammar school teacher, master, to prepare students to attend Harvard College. Educational philosophy at this time was perennialism. The aim of education was to prepare students for higher education. (1879). There we go. Oh, 1887. Okay, in 1887, Northwest Ordinance is enacted by the Congress of the Confederation of the United States. The ordinance provided a plan for westward expansion where slavery would be banned and new states or free states. The ordinance stipulated that with the acquisition of new land, a section of the land in every township would be reserved for the support of education. In 1824, the Office of Indian Affairs was an agency established by John Calhoun, the Secretary of War. He did this without authorization from Congress. It operated under the administration of the War Department. The significance of this agency is that it was created so the U.S. government could negotiate treaties with Native American tribes for lands and the neutrality of the Indians during the Revolutionary War. It became a stepping stone towards the education of Native American children. In 1831, two U.S. Supreme Court cases changed the nature of tribal sovereignty. The court ruled that Indian tribes were not foreign nations but were considered domestic dependent nations, thereby providing the basis for federal protection of Indian tribes. In the case of the Cherokee Nations versus Georgia, the court stated the Indians were not U.S. citizens, or are they independent nations? This is significant because by stating that Indian tribes were not foreign nations but considered domestic dependent nations, this allowed the U.S. government to gain even more control over native lands. The positive outcome from this ruling is now the government had to provide federal support for tribes. This later included education. In 1832, the federal government assigns the responsibility for Indian education to the Commissioner of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. There was still national concern for the education of Native Americans. It was felt that if Native Americans could be educated, then the U.S. government could control them and gain more lands through treaties. Within the next decade, a Native American would be appointed to the office of Commissioner of Indian Affairs in 1869. His name was Eli Samuel Parker. In 1837, Massachusetts forms its State Board of Education. Horace Mann becomes the head of the State Board of Education of Massachusetts. Mann has visions of better educational systems. His goal was to establish non-religious public schools that would provide common education to all citizens. He was a visionary educator who wanted to establish free public schools for all children. He wanted better trained teachers and increased funding for public schools. In 1851, the state of Massachusetts passes the first compulsory education law. The purpose of this law is to ensure that poor children of immigrants attend school so they become civilized, learn restraint, and obedience. The need to become good workers and not contribute to social upheaval. This is still the perennialist educational philosophy. Educate the young in reading, writing. The philosophy of the time does approach essentialism philosophy because at this time, children are being prepared either for college or for vocational education. In 1864, Congress makes it illegal for Native Americans to be taught in their native languages. In the past, Native American children still received education through missionaries. Congress now insists that Native American children as young as 4 years old be taken from their homes and sent to boarding schools. The boarding schools are under the supervision by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. In 1879, the first military boarding school for Indians opens in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Established by Richard Pratt, this boarding school is the first of several military boarding schools open in the United States. The schools were established and funded by the federal government. However, the schools were run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs or religious missionaries under the contract by the U.S. government. The purpose of the military boarding schools was to isolate the Native American children from their parents while suppressing their native languages and culture. The focus on education was in Christianity, education in English, and an introduction into private property. Later, these schools included industrial training. In these military-style boarding schools, many Native American children died from disease. There was another attempt of the U.S. government to control Native American people and their lands under the guise of helping the Native Americans. In 1891, the Congressional Act of 1891 authorizes the Commissioner of the Indian Affairs to make and enforce regulations and rules that ensure that Indian children attend some school. There were numerous treaties negotiated with tribes that included technical education, agriculture, and mechanical arts. Attendance in school became mandatory for all Native American children. In 1892, the National Educational Association establishes the Committee of 10. Across the nation, there was competition in the academic philosophies of education and what should be taught. The committee was established to resolve these issues in education. Their purpose was to establish a standardized secondary school curriculum. One of the philosophies supported critical thinking skills and the other supported rote memorization. The American high schools were divided into institutions that separated students into college-bound and working trade groups. The committee recommended that students should have 8 years elementary school and 4 years of high school. Subjects taught would be English, math, civics, and history to all students in every year in high school. This is a picture of their report. In 1896, the Supreme Court rendered its decision in the case of Homer Plessy versus Ferguson, thus beginning its long separate but equal case in South Carolina. The lawsuit filed in Louisiana stated that segregation violated the 13th and 14th Amendments. The separate but equal law required blacks to ride in separate rail cars. When Homer refused, he was arrested. The decision of the Supreme Court was that it upheld the constitutionality of state laws requiring segregation in public facilities. Racial segregation extended to Native American communities and the notion that they were second-class citizens. In 1924, the Native American Citizenship Act. There. Native American Citizenship Act is passed. Federal government officially classifies Native Americans as citizens. They were even given the right to vote in tribal elections, local, federal, and state elections. This was largely due to the military service of many Native Americans during World War I. Unfortunately, many states governed their own voting laws, and oftentimes making the laws that would eliminate the voting rights of Native Americans. In 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act passed by the U.S. Congress. The new policy sought to protect Native American Indians from loss of their lands and provided funds for growth and economic development. It also helped to reestablish their tribal governments. The Dawes Act is repealed, ending the allotment era, where Indian territory was divided up and distributed to individual Indians to own. The Johnson-O'Malley Act passes, allowing states to oversee public schools on reservation lands. The legislature that passed this act felt that it would be more beneficial for Native American children to attend public schools instead of having private or segregated schools. The public schools would be paid 35 to 50 cents per day for Indian children enrolled in schools. In 1943, there were 19 elementary schools that were classified as special schools, serving the Native American communities. The schools were still segregated and served Native American communities throughout the states of South Carolina. In 1954, on May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court announced its decision in the case of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. This case was based on when Oliver Brown walked his 8-year-old daughter to school, the closest school to their house. He tried to enroll her. She was denied enrollment, and the case of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas was filed. The schools were separate but not equal in the eyes of the people. On May 17, 1954, the decision was made that schools would be integrated. However, there was a loophole left in the decision. States did not enforce the decision. It took 2 decades before desegregation was enforced. This was the time of the progressivism philosophy in education. 1964. The Civil Rights Act becomes law. Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination based on sex, race, color, religion, or nation of origin. This decision overturned the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision, stating separate but equal was constitutional. This landmark decision required states to end segregation in public schools. President Lyndon Johnson stated that schools could lose federal funds if they did not integrate. This was to give states incentive to follow the law and integrate all schools or lose federal support. The following year, increased federal funding was offered to schools to continue the process of integration. This follows the progressivism philosophy of education. The 1968 Indian Civil Rights Act is passed. This congressional act revised Public Law 280, which transferred jurisdiction of most tribal lands to state governments. This new act required states to obtain tribal consent prior to extending any legal jurisdiction over an Indian reservation. It also gave most protections of the Bill of Rights and the 14th Amendment to tribal members in matters with their own tribal governments. The same Bill of Rights afforded other ethnic groups would now be afforded to tribal members. In 1972, the Indian Education Act is passed. This act authorizes funding for special bilingual and bicultural programs for Native American schools. These programs propose culturally relevant teaching materials and appropriate training and hiring of counselors to work with Native American children. It was realized that they met the unique educational and culturally related academic needs of the American Indians and Native Alaskans. Students would be provided culturally relevant education while still meeting the stringent academic state standards of all students. Title IV is amended, establishing the Office of Indian Educational National Advisory Council and providing more funding for special programs and educational opportunities for Native Americans. The Title VII, the Bilingual Education Act, funds the development of programs that employ bilingual education methodology, techniques, and practices of Indian schools. This does not only apply to the Indian schools, but enforce bilingual education in public schools. Although bilingual laws have been passed previously, school districts were still trying to figure out how to provide bilingual education in public schools effectively. In conclusion, all photographs that were provided were taken from Google.com images. Here's a list of my references that can be seen in my paper that accompanies this video. And in conclusion, Native Americans, under the guise of we are doing what is right, what really surprises me is that people that came here for religious freedom forced their religions on the Native American peoples of this country, thinking that what they were doing was doing the right thing, when what they had in mind was to educate them and make them Christians, to make taking their lands and putting them on reservations easier. The Native American tribes have fought for education. It has come a long ways, and they still have boarding schools such as Sherman Indian High School that educates students and provides them with college opportunities, and the students are paid by the government for each student that attends school. Normally the money that these children make goes back home to the tribes because they are still living on reservations. Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation.